All right, we're going to talk about American mobilization for World War I. I promise you this won't take that long. Hopefully not. But this kind of piggybacks off what we did today in class. We looked at the Zimmerman Note, the German resumption of submarine warfare, and after that point in time, Americans declare war, and Wilson's going, his famous declaration is "Make the world safe for democracy." But the question you have to ask is, are we really ready for war? Because let's face it, the country is still somewhat split on the issue. There was actually 50 representatives from the House of Reps, and 6 senators who actually dissented from voting for the war. And so you have still sort of a hesitant public. And so it's really up to, in some ways, the American government to kind of get the people ready or mobilized for World War I. So the question is, were we ready for war? Well, I just want to show you some of these pictures. Like the tank up there on the right, that was like our tank to be ready for World War I. These guys down the bottom on the left, they are practicing with rifles that were used from the Spanish-American War, and the artillery guys, are actually using logs to practice sight targets they would use in a real live war exercise practice of using artillery. I get a kick out of the tank because it looks like an outhouse. So I showed you this slide because are we ready for war? No, we're not. And so you're going to see that we're going to engage in several different things. The government's going to engage in several different sort of agencies or boards to kind of get us ready. First is Selective Service Act, War Industries Board, Food Administration, Field Administration, Committee on Public Information, Treasury Department, and the National War Labor Board. So let's take each one of those right quick and we'll look at them. This is selective service. Selective service would be what you and I would call the draft or conscription. This began 6 weeks after the declaration of war, and we had to have it because if you looked at it, our army was literally the 15th largest in the world, which pales in comparison to a lot of those European countries that have been drafting soldiers for years and had these armies millions and millions of the size of millions and millions of guys. The army by the end of the war, we grew from 100,000 to over 4 million. So Selective Service Act is going to be very busy when war is declared. I mean, literally they start in June of 1917. And that picture down there on the bottom right is actually a picture of Woodrow Wilson grabbing a lottery number, because that's how they would tell how your number was picked, and then you would serve. And he's doing that as sort of a PR thing. Next, I wanted to show you this right. Yeah, okay, there was also a lot of pressure, peer pressure, work or fight. And so the government kind of said that either get a job, work in the armaments industry or munitions industry, or go fight. Unemployed workers would be immediately drafted. Men in key industries were exempt, such as shipbuilding, aircraft building, things like that. Those guys were exempt from the draft. African Americans were drafted, but in segregated units, which we'll address a little bit later. So there was a lot of pressure to fight, to serve your country. And these posters on the left are some promotion posters, some propaganda posters, and you can see like the lady and the baby to kind of pluck at your heartstrings, and the whole patriotic sort of theme of all those, which is important for us, what we're going to do tomorrow. The War Industries Board. Okay, the War Industries Board was headed by a fellow named Bernard Baruch, and the whole purpose of this is to convert the industrial plants, which were making consumer products, and make them produce and manufacture war materials. So if there's some kind of plant that's making refrigerators, then they're going to basically reconvert that plant to make cannons. The other thing is they almost had to threaten a military takeover of the plants because there was still a lot of resistance to the war, and then there was also a lot of people who were making consumer goods, be it radios, be it whatever. They didn't want to produce for the war. They wanted to continue making consumer products that people would buy. The other thing is they controlled all available resources and in manufacturing facilities. So any sort of plants or anything like that, this sort of government board would control them. They fixed prices because during a war, usually prices go up, and so they're fixing prices to prevent inflation. And they raised the volume of munitions produced. And these pictures right here are a picture of women. They're in a factory right there, and this is a promotional poster on your left from the War Labor Board. Food Administration. Um, this was probably one of the more popular ones, and it was headed by a guy who's going to be a future president, Herbert Hoover. And the goal was to feed U.S. troops and war-torn Europeans. Okay, because a lot of Europeans couldn't farm because they're fighting over most of the continent, and so it was really up to American farmers to kind of step in the breach. And so because American farmers were having to produce a lot, crops were really low and scarce, and so that would create inflation. So there was a lot of pressure for other people, for us, average Joe, to produce their own food. Because you can see farm production increased 25%. And food exports to allies tripled. So the question is, what are Americans going to do about their own food at home? So the focus was on avoid wasting food. As a result of this, you heard a lot of sort of promotions to clean your plate, starving kids, and fill in the blank for the country, be it Belgium, be it France, or wherever. And so there was kind of a whole thing where they would put a little bit of a guilt complex on you, and so the parents would tell their kids, clean your plate because there's starving kids in this country. I remember I heard that when I was a kid. Of course, I didn't live during World War I. Provided menus without staples like sugar. So because sugar was so scarce, they would come up with menus to show to housewives to say, well, this is how you make this particular dish without this particular staple like sugar. And so they provided that. Probably the biggest thing, though, was what we call victory gardens, and this is what you saw cropping up all across the country at that time. And the Food Administration used posters and billboards and newspapers and movies to kind of promote saving food. They would promote these kinds of things like Meatless Tuesdays, Wheatless Wednesdays, and to kind of encourage Americans to abstain from eating those foods during those days so that we could sort of ration more food for the soldiers. But the big thing, like I said before, was the victory gardens. And you saw this all over the place. And people would come up with their own gardens. They would convert their yards into gardens so they could provide food for themselves, and therefore the farmers would be free to provide more food to the troops and also the Europeans who were struggling to provide food for themselves. The Fuel Administration was the other one. And in this case, because fuel was being used for the war effort, it was important they ensured adequate production of coal and oil to keep prices down, because that fuel was being diverted to Europe, and so therefore you have this sort of situation where there's less of it, and so the price would go up. And so the idea was to continue that adequate production of coal and oil for consumer production. And so they even implemented daylight savings time, and albeit that was temporarily, that was another thing they did. And they would come up with the same sort of themes like lightless nights, heatless Mondays, gasless Sundays, those kinds of things to kind of encourage Americans to save and sort of ration their fuel intake. Probably one of the most prominent of the boards was the Committee on Public Information. And this was solely about propaganda, led by a fellow named George Creel, very creative guy. But they used propaganda to rally support for the war. And he would hire several thousand guys, what they called 4-minute men. And these 4-minute men would go around the country. They'd step up on a soapbox, any sort of corner, and they would just start speaking. They'd give a 4-minute speech to get people fired up, short patriotic speeches on the war, and then they pick up their box and they go to another corner and do the same thing. They called those guys 4-minute men. But the other thing they did was produce a lot of anti-German movies. So they got Hollywood involved, The Kaiser, The Beast of Berlin. So these are sort of anti-German movies with sort of a propaganda theme that was basically almost in some ways ethnic slurs, call them Huns and things like that. And they would get, also they would encourage the purchase of Liberty bonds, which we'll address in a second. And so they would use Hollywood movie stars to do that as well, to get people to buy bonds to support the war effort. And the Treasury Department are the ones who sold the Liberty bonds. War bonds or victory bonds were sold to raise money. And they would use, like this guy Douglas Fairbanks and people like that, get people fired up, and they'd have big rallies, and they would buy these victory bonds. And we've talked about this. This isn't the first time we've used them, Liberty loan drives, and you can see this. That's what they're doing in the picture. They're having drives to get people to buy more of these bonds. In fact, probably $21 billion was raised, which is about 2/3 of the cost of the war. And so the Liberty bond drive was very successful. The National War Labor Board was something that unions loved, because the purpose was to prevent strikes that would disrupt war production. So there was a lot of pro sort of union policies that were passed. They strengthened unions by allowing for collective bargain, and they got to have 8-hour workdays. And so during this time, you actually saw union membership grow by roughly 1 million members. There you go, right there. And the last thing, which I'm not going to have you know this for tomorrow, what we're going to do, but it's important too as well, the Espionage and Alien Acts, to sort of prevent dissent about the war. One of the things they did is they instilled penalties for if you were caught spying or sabotage or obstructing the war effort. That was palatable. But the one part of the law that was not so palatable was providing penalties for Americans for speaking or writing against American government or the war effort. And so in that sense, it was against the First Amendment. And a lot of Americans did not like this. This is one of the more unpopular ones. This we also, for tomorrow purposes, we don't have to know as much, but the role of women is usually during the war. Women really stepped in the breach where men left and went to war. You can see this young lady here. She's working farm equipment that her brother would usually be doing. And so women did replace men in the workplace, but gave these jobs up at the war's end when the men came back. Now, some questions I want you to look at. And these are questions I want you to have. I'm going to check these tomorrow when you get in class. What is mobilization? How is American mobilization different than European nations? Think an ocean. Explain why each of these 7 boards were necessary for the success of the U.S. military. Just do it in 1 or 2 sentences. And then I want you to, the most important part is, give one example of how you promote or sell that federal agency to the public. How are you going to promote or get people fired up about that agency? All right, just one quick example. Then think which of these boards are the most critical to the success of the U.S. and why. Explain that in 2 or 3 sentences. Was American mobilization successful? Did it work at the end of the war? Was it successful? And then at what personal cost? And then finally, how involved was the federal government? That last question you should probably be able to figure out after looking at this PowerPoint. It ain't too hard to figure that part out. Okay, make sure you answer these questions. I will check for them tomorrow when you get in. This is for a grade, so make sure that you have these. And then you'll see what we'll do in class. All right, thanks. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.